are you, my holy sisters and brothers? What a beautiful song that was, Ein Kelokenu. There is no God like our God. That was sung by Eitan Katz from a Shlomo Carlebach melody. It's Sunday night, and we got a beautiful page to learn together today. Not very long, but juicy. It's going to be a good one. Let's light up the darkness. And who is going to be with us as we get going on a Sunday evening? Paula from Chicago, Sharon from Lebanon, New Jersey, Yehudit from South Carolina, Carol from Cleveland, Stephen from Dover, New Hampshire, and Lucy from Minnesota. His Facebook keeps jumping. Harold says Erev Tov. Miriam says Shavua Tov from Hayden, Colorado. John from Michigan. Nancy from Southern Pines. Pauline from Arkansas. Kathy from Los Angeles, and Brandon from Knoxville, as well as Rochelle. I heard the wind in the trees today, loved it. And Pam Simmons says Shavua Tov, and Shalom from Nashville. Over there on the YouTube side, Lindsay with us from Cincinnati, and Marjorie from Georgia. Great to be with you. We are holding on Daf Ayin Vav, that's page 76 of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. Yesterday we completed chapter 6, so we're opening chapter 7 and the first Mishna of chapter 7. There are 8 Mishnas in this chapter. They're all pretty compact. This first Mishnah is going to expand on the discussion we've been having, which is we've been discussing Eruvin, which are formed within courtyards and between courtyards. So when there's multiple homes sharing a courtyard, the residents of that courtyard have to form an eruv so that they're going to be allowed to carry objects in and out of their homes to the courtyard. And we've also seen that they can join courtyards. That 2 courtyards or more can be joined into one courtyard if they make an eruv, a joint eruv for that purpose. That's different than merging the alleyway, where multiple courtyards open into an alleyway, and we're going to join all the courtyards that open into that alleyway. It's different. That's merging the alleyway with respect to the courtyards. But when we join courtyards, there has to be an opening between the courtyards. In the wall between the courtyards, there has to be some kind of an opening. And in this chapter, we're going to be discussing what separates courtyards. When are they permitted to join into one large courtyard, as it were? When are they prohibited to join into one large courtyard? When are they obligated to join into one large courtyard? Basically, right, if there's a small opening, but it's big enough, if there's no opening or a very tiny opening, they can't join the courtyards. If there's a medium-sized opening, they can join the courtyards, but they don't have to join the courtyards. And if it's a very large opening, then it's as if there's no wall between them, and they must join the courtyards. In other words, they must all join in the eruv together, or the people in both courtyards are going to be prohibited to carry objects in and out of their houses on Shabbos. That's the general topic. And so in this first Mishnah, we're going to be looking at, well, how do we define that opening between the courtyards? This is very much going to touch on relationships between neighbors. And I was reminded, and that's why if you recognize the allusion in the title of today's show, Good Fences Make Good Neighbors, that's a line from a Robert Frost poem. I remember enjoying it very much in college. I don't even want to say how many years ago. And I haven't really looked at the poem since then, but I remember the line and the poem. And I took it out, and it's really such a good poem, and such a, it's touching, and it really, Robert Frost with that little, keen twinkle in his eye and that great sense of humor really gets at relationships between people. He can capture a relationship with such few words and such a poignant image of 2 people and how they relate to each other. And so I thought I would just start by reading you the poem that line is taken from. Good fences make good neighbors. It's a line that occurs twice in the poem Mending Wall by Robert Frost. This is the poem. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps that two can pass abreast. And by the way, I'm not just reading this to you because it's fun and poignant and poetic. Think about what's going on in this poem, and it's going to relate to what we're discussing. It's very much about the relationship between two neighbors. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time, we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet and walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each. And some are loaves, and some are so nearly balls, we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. There, where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines. I tell him, he only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. To whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. And he moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. He says again, good fences make good neighbors. So the poet, right? So Robert Frost in his persona as the first person writer of this poem, saying, why do we really need this wall between us, right? I have pine trees, I have apple trees, you have pine trees. We don't own animals that are going to wander into each other's yards. What difference does it make if we have this wall between our properties? And my neighbor, who heard it from his father, says, hey, you stay on your side, I stay on mine. Let's have a clear division between us. Good fences make good neighbors. Who's more in the right here? Let's see what the sages have to say on this subject. Okay, our first Mishna here in chapter 7 says that if there is an opening in the wall between my courtyard and your courtyard, right, my neighboring courtyard, so if there is an opening, there needs to be an opening. So if there's no opening, for sure, you have your courtyard, I have my courtyard. We cannot join our courtyards in an eruv so that we could carry things not only within our courtyards, but between our courtyards on Shabbos. There must be an opening. What is the minimum requirements of that opening? It must be at least 4 tefachim, that's 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths. So it's a square, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's about 4 handbreadths, right? So 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths. It's really a window, but this is a window that a person could fit through. I mean, really, that's the bottom line, right? And that opening must be within 10 handbreadths of the ground. There must be no more than 10 handbreadths from the ground. Otherwise, it's considered too high, and we won't have that option. But if it's at least 4 by 4 handbreadths, and it's within 10 handbreadths of the ground, then we have the choice. We could just you make an eruv in your courtyard, I make an eruv in my courtyard. But if we desire, we may join our courtyards. We don't have to, but we may. We are permitted to join the courtyards with a joint eruv. But if this opening is less than 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths in size, the opening is less than 4 by 4, or if it is more than 10 handbreadths above the ground, so, 10 handbreadths, something like this, about waist high off the ground. And if the opening is higher than that, then we are not permitted to join the courtyards. This opening is not significant or useful enough. You can make your eruv on your side so that the houses in your courtyard can carry in and out of the houses within that courtyard. I can make an eruv on my side for the multiple houses in our courtyard, but we cannot join our courtyards. Very good. Let me just look at this. And now, so that the Gemara is going to make 2 comments immediately on this Mishnah. The first is on this 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths. And it just sort of notes that, this 4 handbreadth measurement seems to accord with that ruling of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who said that, for example, if you've got 2 fences or a fence that comes near the edge of an alley and it comes within 4 handbreadths of reaching the end, right? So it's like it closes off some larger opening, and the fence comes within 4 handbreadths of closing it completely. That is close enough to a complete partition, even though there's an opening there. According to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, if that opening is less than 4 handbreadths, it's as if the 2 partitions were connected, and we could consider this a closed area. So it must be that where we get the 4 handbreadths is, according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, that less than that is considered an insignificant opening. And then the Gemara says, no, it rejects this idea and says, no, this is even accords with the ruling of the rabbis who disagree with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who said that a fence has to come within 3 handbreadths of the other fence that it's nearing, approaching. If they're within 3 handbreadths of each other, then it's considered as if they are lavud, connected. But if it's more than 3, they're not connected. They're considered, there's a gap in that fence. And so how is it that this opening, this window in the wall between the 2 courtyards could accord with the rabbis who say that anything less than 3 handbreadths is considered connected, but more than that is not, where our minimum size here for our window is 4 by 4. And the Gemara is saying, even the rabbis would agree that an opening 4 by 4 is considered hashav, significant, in accordance with our Mishnah, and it really has nothing to do with the concept of lavud. So there you go. They brought it in just to dismiss the idea. 4 by 4 means it's hashav. It's significant. A 4 by 4 opening is significant. I'm guessing it's because a person could fit through there. But they haven't explained where they get the 4 by 4. The next comment of the Gemara on our Mishnah is, there's 2 clauses. The first clause said, if it's 4 by 4 and it's within 10 handbreadths of the ground, then they have the choice to join the courtyards. And the second clause was, and if it's not 4 by 4 handbreadths and it's more than 10 handbreadths above the ground, or it's more than 10 handbreadths above the ground, then they cannot join the courtyards. And so the Gemara comments, why do we need the second clause? The first clause said it needed to be 4 by 4 and within 10. Why do we need the second one, which says, and if it's not 4 by 4 or it's not within 10, then they don't have that option to join the courtyards? And the Gemara answers its own question, that the second clause comes to teach us that opening, that 4 by 4 handbreadths opening, It doesn't have to be all of it within 10 handbreadths of the ground. All it means is that some of it is within 10 handbreadths of the ground. If just a little bit of that window is within 10 handbreadths of the ground, it qualifies and we could join our courtyards. And then the Gemara says, well, we also have a baraisa which says the same thing. A baraisa, contemporaneous with the Mishna, not quite as authoritative. And the baraisa says that if most of the window is above, but some of it is below 10 handbreadths from the ground, they may join the courtyards. And if most of it is below 10 handbreadths, but some of it is above 10 handbreadths, they may join the courtyards. And about this baraisa, the Gemara comments the same thing. And now here, this is not boring at all. Here we're learning how to talk to people when we want to have a good relationship and we want to be really clear. So the Gemara asks, okay, this baraisa, we know that it needs to be within 10 handbreadths of the ground, and it has already said if most of the window is above 10 handbreadths, but if just some of it is below 10 handbreadths, it's going to qualify and they can join the courtyards. So is it really necessary to say that if most of the opening is below that 10 handbreadth limit and just a little bit of it is above, that they are permitted to join the courtyards? Why is it even necessary to say that? And the Gemara answers, indeed, the baraisa, the Tana of the baraisa, the rabbi whose ruling is spelled out in this baraisa, is teaching in the style of this, and it is unnecessary to say that. This is a very Talmudic teaching. It's a style of teaching which is this, here's a fact, and here's another fact which is obvious and is therefore unnecessary to state it, but we do state it. And so my pals, my question for you is, if the style is this, and it is unnecessary to say that, like we say if most of it is above, but some of it is below, then it is unnecessary to say that if most of it is below and some of it is above, it also qualifies. So why say it? If we just establish that the style of teaching is, here's the main fact, and it is unnecessary to say the secondary fact, why say it at all? That's what the Gemara is asking, and it doesn't really answer. The answer was, oh, well, that's the style of teaching. This, and it is unnecessary to say that. But why adopt that style? Why teach something which is the main case and then add on something which is obvious and follows from, and it is really unnecessary to state? It was unnecessary to state it, so why state it? If you have an answer, put it in the comments. I'm really curious. Now, I'm going to suggest an answer, but this is just Sal suggesting. It's not spelled out here in our daf. But I say the reason we add in our teaching, okay, now that we've established this, it's unnecessary to say that in such a situation it's going to be like that. We say it that way, I believe, to keep us in the broad picture, the big picture, even as we're spelling out the minutiae, right? And when we're advocating for a position where we're clarifying like an informal contract, right? We're just saying, okay, we're going to agree, for example, not long ago, a couple years ago, we built a fence actually between our house and our neighbor. The neighbor ended up moving away. Not because of this incident, but we definitely got together and talked about the fence, right? And we didn't, get paper and pen and write a contract and agree what our rights and obligations would be. But we did talk about who would pay for the fence, how high the fence would be, etc., and how this fence would come to be. And it was important. I built it on my side of the property. I certainly could have just built the fence. The law in Los Angeles is I can just build that fence as long as it's within the code of the city. But I would say to anybody, if you're going to build a fence between you and your neighbor that's going to affect how they enjoy their house. How high is that fence? What's it going to be made out of? Are there going to be gaps in it? What kind of plants? What kind of foundation? In order to build it, my workers are going to have to be on your property, etc. You definitely want to achieve clarity. And when you're going over the nuts and bolts of how we're going to live beside each other, and not just, neighbors building a fence, but anything that two people are going to agree on, how we're going to share resources at work, how we're going to organize the carpool, who's going to drive on what day, which kids are going to be picked up first, etc. It's good to spell out the details. But even as we're spelling out the details and we're kind of getting lost in the weeds, as it were, in the details, it's good to not just at the beginning and at the end, but even as we make our way through the details, to sort of keep jumping out for a moment and getting that big objective view, the 30,000-foot view, and remind people, and like this, it's not even necessary to say that, but it is necessary because we're reminding each other of why we're having this conversation in the first place. The general, conclusion that we both came to, that it would be good to work together, and that we agree to work together, and that we like working together, and that we want to keep working together, and here's how we're going to do it. And let's remember, we want to keep working together, and here's how we're going to do it. It's just, the sages are really reminding us how to get along when we need to get along. All right, let's continue. Okay, yes. And now that we're talking about that there's a kind of spiritual and practical and neighborly and coworker and colleague underpinning to this whole discussion, now let's get back to what we're talking about. Are we going, because imagine that this opening that we're going to leave, which is going to enable us to join the courtyards if we wish. Right? So the sages are sort of defining, well, if you have such an opening, you can join the courtyards or you can't. Well, if we're building the wall, we're going to keep this ruling in mind when we decide, are we going to leave an opening in the fence between our properties? Are we going to leave an ability to cross directly from my property to yours and back? It could be a door that's left locked, firmly locked in place. But should we build such a door at all? I mean, after all, we could just go out on the street, go out my front door, walk up the street, go to your front door. That's the normal way to deal with each other. We don't want to surprise each other coming through the door in our fence. So maybe we don't need such a door. Or maybe we do. And as I was analyzing this case, I was really thinking first of all, there's many practical situations where you might want to have a door in the fence between two properties. Certainly, if two families are living as neighbors, it might make a lot of sense. If there's emergency situations, if you live in such a place where it would, almost function as a fire escape, what a good idea to have such a door that could be activated when necessary. But on the other hand, we want to be secure. We don't want to be nervous that a burglar could break into your property and then suddenly end up in my property, et cetera, et cetera. So those are practical considerations. But I think there's also a spiritual consideration here, that if you're talking about a wall between people and leaving an opening in the wall, what does that mean? And then I was reminded, recently we're all involved in this upcoming election in America. And, people within the same family can find themselves on different sides of the aisle, sometimes having uncomfortable arguments or silences, or, people finding themselves on different sides of an issue and advocating for their position. And these, being on different sides of an issue can sometimes feel, and sometimes strongly feel, like there's a wall, right, between us, between the people involved. And what would it mean to leave an opening in such a wall? What does it mean to have a wall between you and someone you care about, and to leave an opening in the wall? It's a great question, right? It's a really great question. And I think anybody who's ever studied negotiation knows that, if you're negotiating for a business, if you're negotiating for a position, if you want to end up in a relationship and you want to have, a relationship that really works for you, that's why you're negotiating. You don't want to negotiate so hard that the opponent, the partner in the negotiation, ends up battered into submission and like you win, but they hate you. Then you didn't really win, because that relationship is going to be damaged and it won't last. It certainly won't be what you both want it to be. We want that win-win, right? And to get that win-win, often you have to sort of advocate, have a vision of where you want to end up, but you got to leave that door in the wall, right? Where the communication's going to remain solid, the relationship is going to remain solid, and there's a way to get through the wall that isn't all about winning and losing in the negotiation. Something to think about. All right. The next section of our daf, of our page, I am not going to cover. But if you're into geometry, then you'll find a very interesting explanation of, we know the opening has to be 4 by 4 handbreadths minimum. What if it's not a square or a rectangle? What if it's an odd shape? What if it's a circle? If it's a circle, turns out that it needs to be 24 handbreadths in circumference. A circle with a circumference of 24 handbreadths is quite a bit bigger in area than a square that's 4 by 4. Why? To understand, read this page if you're into geometry. It has to do with where we place that circle. Is it a circle in the square or a circle around the square? And the answer is that it needs to be a circle around the square. And it needs to be 24 handbreadths around, and 2 of those handbreadths have to be below that 10 handbreadths from the ground limit. Okay. And finally, we have the ruling, we have another commentary, another idea, that this opening needs to be within 10 handbreadths of the ground in order to constitute a valid opening that would enable us to join the courtyards if we wanted to. It's a choice, right? We're not obligated or prohibited. We would be permitted to join the courtyards, so people could carry between the courtyards if we have this opening, 4 by 4 handbreadths within 10 handbreadths of the ground. And as we saw, within 10 handbreadths means that just part of the opening is within 10 handbreadths. That is if the opening is in the wall between courtyards. But it sometimes happens that there is a wall, that there's a house right on the property line, right? That the house is right at the edge is on the wall. And on the other side of the wall, there's another house in the other courtyard. And so it's like 2 houses share a wall. I mean, we see this in cities all the time. That's what a townhouse is, right? They have a courtyard, but the houses themselves also share a wall. Can they join the courtyards if the opening between the courtyards is an opening between 2 houses? Answer, absolutely. And in fact, it still has to be at least 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths size. Of the area of the opening needs to be that big, but we no longer have the requirement that it be within 10 handbreadths of the ground. At any height, it will work. It doesn't have to be within 10 handbreadths of the ground to be a practical opening that we could join the courtyards, meaning that it would be practical for a person to get through. It could be any height. Why? Because we have a principle in the Talmud that houses, for purposes of certain laws, like the opening between 2 houses in an eruv, the house is considered filled. It's as if the floor is at any level that you need it to be. So the opening is always considered to be within 10 handbreadths of the floor, even if it's, several stories above the ground. Even if it's, a house with a very high ceiling, let's say it has 20-foot ceilings, and this opening is way up there near the ceiling, and you really couldn't get up into that opening without a lot of difficulty. Nevertheless, we could use that opening to justify joining the courtyards because houses are considered to be filled. And Rav Steinsaltz explains, what does it mean that a house is filled? It means that a house always contains tables and chairs furniture that we could stack if we needed to. And so when there's a house, there's going to be a way to get up to that opening if we needed to get up to the opening. Whereas with a courtyard and an opening in the wall between two courtyards, there isn't necessarily, something there that's going to allow us to get through that opening, something that's convenient. In a house, it's considered convenient enough. And not only can we put that opening between the walls as high as necessary, but if we were trying to join with an eruv, two houses that weren't next to each other and sharing a wall, but even were one over the other, perhaps one opens into one courtyard, the other opens into another courtyard, but they're actually positioned over each other, and the opening between these two houses is in the ceiling of the lower house and in the floor of the upper house. So who was it, Rabban? Who asked the question? Rabbi Abba raised the dilemma before Rav Nachman. So if the opening is in the ceiling of the lower house and the floor of the upper house, is this really going to count as an opening that we could use to join the courtyards? Or would it only work if there's a ladder in the house so we can get up to the ceiling? Either a permanent ladder affixed to this opening, or at least a temporary ladder that was available and we could put it up to that opening. And Rav Nachman answered him, we don't even need a ladder. If there's an opening of 4x4 handbreadths, no matter where it is, no matter how high, even in the ceiling, even in the middle of the room, we consider that good enough as an opening between the houses to be able to join the courtyards if we so desire. That's what I've got for us today. Let me check your comments and questions. Nancy says, Robert Frost had that New England ability to state the truth succinctly but with a touch of imagery. It's a movie for the mind. Oh, Nancy. Beautiful. You expressed that better than I could. Exactly. 100% agree with you. Yosef Shum, I live near Frost's home. The farm outside of the city here is beautiful. I could see where the inspiration came from. Thank you, Yosef. Lucy says, I love the idea of both a wall and an opening. It makes better neighbors than a wall alone. Yeah, and I was just thinking about this the other day where we have our backyard minyan, where we get together to pray on Friday nights. I noticed that the guy whose house we're at, he has a door in the wall between him and his neighbor. And I know that neighbor, I don't even know if he's Jewish or not. He certainly doesn't come over and pray with us. So I don't know that they ever opened that door, but somebody built it. The houses in this neighborhood most of them were built around 1920. So somebody built that door at some point. I got to ask Kusiel about it and, hear what he has to say. How did that door come to be and do they ever use it? Sharon says, one would have to consider if the property of one or the other changes ownership. What if you want the opening with the original owner, but not with the subsequent owner? That's exactly right. So if you decided to build such an opening, you would have to consider at that moment, but one of us may not want that opening in the future. One of us may not want that opening tomorrow. And certainly one of us may not want that opening still there when the other one moves away and we have to deal with some new neighbors. So it's got to be built into the relationship that we can shut that door. Both of us have the right. It's like, the connecting door with two hotel rooms, right? Either one can lock it so the other one has no access. They both have to agree to open a connecting door right between rooms in a hotel. And it seems like a similar idea. And finally, Pam Simmons says, with light, the breadth of communication is always possible. Very good, Pam. And as Nina likes to say, it is so important never to ascribe bad intentions to people that we're in a discussion with, in a debate with, even an argument, even a nasty argument. Let's focus on what it is that we're arguing about and not assume that that's some kind of bad person who's bad generally and their badness is coming to bear in our debate. Most people are decent. Most people have values and have a good reason to feel the way that they do, right? And even today, when the country's so divided, it's so important to remember that, no matter how superior we might feel to the people who disagree with us, that's a bad assumption to make. We're not superior. Probably they have very similar values to us. We both care about the same values, but on these issues, we might prioritize the values in a different order and end up in a different position. But odds are we both care about family, we both care about children, we both care about freedom, we both care about democracy, we both care about health and safety, etc. And we might just order our priorities different. And if we leave that opening between us, right, and then we just stick to what needs to be in the wall and what doesn't, we're all going to be in a better place. That's what I've got for us today. May this be a lesson of utility for all of us. Have a great evening, my holy sisters and brothers.